silver chain snapped against her throat and bit into the soft skin beneath her jaw. Her bare knees struck wet stone. Somewhere above the crypt, the hounds were still barking, but down here the only sound was her own breathing and the slow drip of water against marble. Two gloved hands forced her head up. A crown rested on the lid of a black sarcophagus. It was old. It was wrong. It was watching her. The crown lifted itself, slow as a held breath, and drifted across the cold air toward her brow. The men holding her chains screamed and let go. Her name is Alara Vane. She is 22 years old this winter, and until this exact freezing second, she was nothing more than a quiet scullery maid sold to the Ashford line for the price of a single bag of grain. Stay with me on this one. The Ashford Manor sat at the end of a long valley that the locals had stopped naming aloud about 2 centuries ago. They called it the Hollow now, the way you might call a wound a mark to make it smaller than it was. Alara had been brought there at the age of 9, with nothing but a wool shawl and a wooden comb her mother had pressed into her palm before the carriage door closed. The comb had been taken from her on the first night. The shawl had been burned on the second. By the third, she had learned not to cry where Lady Ashford could hear her, because Lady Ashford collected sounds the way other women collected lace, and a crying girl was a sound she liked very much. For 13 years, Alara scrubbed the long corridor that connected the kitchens to the cold cellar. In winter, the water froze in patches, and she cracked the ice with her own knuckles because the housekeeper said hot water on a maid was a sin against thrift. The other maids called her Mouse, the way you name something small that you do not expect to live very long. She answered to it. She had forgotten she had any other name. Lady Ashford was a thin woman with red hair, the color of an old burn. She wore black gloves at every meal and never removed them in front of the staff. Her husband had been dead for 9 years, but his chair was still set at the head of the table every night. The staff had stopped asking why. There were things in the hollow you did not ask about if you wanted to keep your tongue inside your mouth, and the husband's empty chair was one of them. On the morning everything changed, Alara woke before the bell. She had been dreaming again, the same dream she had been having since she was a child. In the dream, there was a long hall with black columns, and a man at the end of it who never moved closer. He had eyes the color of wet iron, and when he opened his mouth to speak, the dream always ended. She had stopped wondering what he would say. She had started fearing what he would say. That morning, the housekeeper found her in the corridor with the bucket already filled. The housekeeper looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then she said very softly that Lady Ashford wanted her in the east parlor at noon, washed and in the gray dress, the one with the high collar. Alara did not own a gray dress with a high collar. The housekeeper said one would be provided. Alara asked why. The housekeeper did not answer. The housekeeper would not meet her eyes, and that was when Alara knew that whatever was happening to her today was not a thing the staff would speak of tomorrow. She bathed in the cold trough behind the laundry. The gray dress was waiting on her cot, and the collar was not high to keep her warm. The collar was high to hide her throat. She put the dress on. She walked to the east parlor. She did not cry because Lady Ashford was a collector of sounds. The east parlor smelled of lilies, and something underneath the lilies that was not lilies. Lady Ashford stood by the window with a single black candle already lit, though the sun was high. She turned when Alara entered and smiled, and the smile did not move the rest of her face. She said, "Mouse, today you will be useful." She crossed the room and lifted Alara's chin with one gloved finger. Her glove smelled of iron. She studied Alara's face like a butcher studies a cut of meat for the line of the grain. She said, "You have her cheekbones." Alara did not ask whose. You learn not to ask in the hollow. They put a hood on her before they took her out of the manor. The hood was not for her shame. The hood was for theirs. She felt the gravel under her slippers, then wet orchard leaves, then the harder stones of the old road that led into the wood, the road the staff was forbidden to walk after sundown. The carriage was not a carriage. It was a low cart pulled by 2 black horses that did not snort, did not stamp, did not behave like horses. They were too quiet. She knew the sound of an animal that was breathing, and she knew the absence of it. These horses were the absence of it. The wood went on a long time. Through the hood she could smell wet bark, then wet stone, then a colder smell like old coins held under the tongue. The cart stopped. Hands lifted her down. Her feet found steps that went downward, not upward, and she understood this was not a chapel and not a court. It was a place beneath the world. The hood came off in a chamber with no windows and no candles, only a pale blue light leaking from the seams of the stones, as if the walls remembered being on fire a long time ago and had kept a little of the warmth. There was a sarcophagus in the center of the room. It was black, and it was carved with letters she could not read but which her tongue tried to shape anyway, as if her mouth knew the words her mind did not. On top of the sarcophagus sat a crown. The crown was the color of dried blood. It had no jewels, but the metal itself had veins running through it, and the veins were moving. Alara watched the veins move. They were slow and they were thinking. She felt her own pulse slow down to match them, which was when she began to be afraid in a way she had never been afraid before, because fear has a rhythm, and her rhythm was no longer her own. Lady Ashford stepped into the chamber behind her, with 6 cloaked men, a woman in red with a curved silver knife, and a figure in the corner whose face was bound in linen and whose hands were folded in front of him as if in prayer. Lady Ashford addressed the linen-bound figure. She said, "The offering is presented." The woman in red said, in a voice pulled out of a deep well, that the pact required a maiden of the valley before the second moonrise, and that the Ashford house had honored the pact for 9 generations, and that tonight the pact would be sealed in the old way. The silver chain went around her throat again, but this time it did not bite her. It rested. The woman in red lifted the knife. Alara closed her eyes. She thought, if I die now, no one in the world will say my name again, and that will be the worst part. They took my name from me 13 years ago, and now they will take the small ash of it that is left. The crown moved. It did not roll. It did not fall. It lifted slowly, the way a moth lifts from a cooling lamp, and it crossed the air between the sarcophagus and her brow without anyone touching it. The woman in red dropped the knife. The 6 cloaked men stepped backward as one. Lady Ashford made a sound that Alara had never heard her make, a thin, small sound like a child realizing it has been forgotten in a cold room. The crown settled on Alara's head. It was not heavy. It was warm. It fit her the way a key fits a lock that has been waiting in the dark for a very long time. The veins in the metal began to pulse in time with her heart, and then her heart began to pulse in time with them, and she could no longer tell which was the master and which was the servant. The pale blue light in the seams of the wall flared white. The chamber filled with a sound like a great door being unbarred in another room, far away, by patient hands. The linen came off the bound figure in the corner. He was tall. He was pale, not the pale of sickness, but of stone kept out of the sun for a reason. His hair was black, tied back with a single dark cord. His eyes were the color of wet iron, the exact color of the eyes in the dream she had been having since she was 9 years old. He looked at her and his face did not move, but something behind his face moved, something that had been still for a very long time. Alara recognized the movement, even if she did not yet recognize the man. He took 1 step forward. The cloaked men knelt. Lady Ashford did not kneel, because pride is the last thing a cruel woman puts down. He looked only at Alara. He took a 2nd step, and a 3rd, close enough that she could smell the cold on him. He lowered his head. His mouth was almost at her ear. He whispered, "You returned." The crown grew warmer. The veins in the metal beat once, hard, like a great clock starting in a long empty house. She did not understand the words. She understood them in her bones. Her mouth opened, and a voice that was hers and not hers said, in a language she had never been taught, a single syllable that meant yes. The man flinched as if she had struck him. He straightened. His face was no longer still. It was alive in a way that frightened her more than the knife had, because the new fear was for him, not for herself, and she did not yet know why. He said, "Leave us." The cloaked men rose and left. The woman in red gathered her knife and followed. Lady Ashford did not move. He said it again, "Leave us," and this time the words were not a request. Lady Ashford left. Her black gloves were shaking. The chamber emptied. He turned back to Alara. He stood very still, as if any sudden motion might break her, and she understood with a small sharp sorrow that he had been standing still like this for a very long time. He said, "Do you know me?" She said no. The crown was holding her voice steady. He nodded once, as if the answer was a wound he had been preparing for. He said, "I am Selim Vargo." He said, "The woman whose face you wear was called Sarah. She was queen of the Hollow, and the river and the wood, and the 7 keeps beyond. She was my wife." He said the word wife as if he had not said it aloud in a long time, and was afraid of breaking it. He said, 5 centuries ago, she walked into a snowfall and did not come out. He said, the crown on your head is the crown of hollow veins. It does not choose. It only recognizes. He said, you are Sarah. You are my wife. You are home. The crown beat once more. The pale blue light shifted, and for a moment Alara saw, layered over the chamber, a great hall with black columns and a long table set for 2, and at the end of the hall a snowfall, and a woman walking into the snowfall without turning back. The image faded. She was in the crypt again. Selim was watching her face for any sign that the image had passed through her too. She did not know what her face was doing. She felt as if she had stepped off a cliff and forgotten to fall. He led her out by a passage she had not seen come in. It opened into a hall that was inside the hill, and the hill was not large enough to contain the hall. The ceiling was black stone with veins of the same red metal as the crown, and the veins flickered as she passed beneath them. Pale figures stood along the walls, dressed in old cloth. She thought they were statues until one turned its head slowly to follow her with its eyes. She did not flinch. The crown was teaching her to be a thing that did not flinch. He brought her to a throne room. It was small with 2 seats on a low dais, one dust and one clean. He led her to the clean one. She sat. He knelt in front of her, not as a servant, but as a man who has been carrying something heavy a long time and has finally found somewhere to set it down. He said, "I will not ask anything of you tonight." He said, "You have not slept in a bed that was your own in 13 years. He said, "I have watched the Ashford house, and I have watched you, and I am sorry." He said the word sorry, the way a man says a prayer he is not sure will be heard. He rose. He left the room. The door closed softly. Alara was alone on the throne. The crown was warm. Her hands were shaking, but not from cold. She lifted one hand and touched the crown at her brow. The metal was smooth. The veins pulsed under her fingers like a small heart, and for a long moment she could not tell whether the heart was hers or his or the crown's own. She thought very simply, I should be afraid. She thought, I am not afraid. She thought that is the most frightening thing. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. A mirror on the far wall moved. The glass rippled, the way water ripples when a stone is dropped into it from very far above, and a shape gathered behind the glass. The shape was a man. He was not Selim. He was taller, broader, with a beard the color of rust, and a long red coat that was not cloth but something darker pretending to be cloth. He pressed one hand flat against the inside of the mirror. Somewhere far above the throne room, a bell began to toll, slow and deep, a bell that did not belong to any chapel in the valley. The mirror man smiled. He did not have ordinary teeth. He said, in a voice that sounded as if it were coming from inside her own skull, "Hello, little queen. Welcome back. We have been waiting for you too." Alara stood. The crown stayed on her brow as if it had grown there. She did not run for the door. She did not call for Selim. Something in the crown was telling her, in a voice that was older than her own, that running was the wrong shape for what she was becoming. She walked toward the mirror instead. The mirror man laughed, low and delighted, and stepped back into the dark behind the glass. He said, "My name is Mordrev." He said, "I am the Lord of the Crimson Reach, and I have a small problem with your husband, and you, my dear, are the solution." He said, "A queen without her memories is a door without a lock." He said, "By the next moonrise you will choose your house, or your house will be chosen for you." He bowed. The glass smoothed. He was gone. The bell above her told a final time and stopped. Selim was already running back through the corridor. He came through the throne room door with his sleeves loose, his hair half untied, his face openly afraid. He saw the smooth glass. He understood without asking. He said one word under his breath that the crown translated for her, a word that meant brother and rival, and the wound that does not close. He said, "Mordrev." She said, "He called me Little Queen." Selim closed his eyes. He said, "Then we have until moonrise." He opened his eyes. He said, "Ilara." He said her maid's name, not the queen's, and it was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in 13 years. He said, "If you do not remember who you were before moonrise, the Crimson Reach will take the crown from your head by force, and the war that begins after will burn the hollow and the river and the 7 keeps, and the valley will not have a name again for another 500 years." He said, "I am asking you to remember. I will help you. I've waited a very long time to ask you anything." The crown beat against her brow, steady, patient, terrible. She thought about the wooden comb her mother had pressed into her hand. She thought about the woman walking into the snowfall without turning back, and how the woman had not been allowed to turn back, and how someone had made her walk into that snow. The crown was beginning to whisper, very quietly, the names of the people who had been in the chamber the night Saria was lost, and one of those names was a name Ilara already knew. One of those names was Ashford. She lifted her chin. The shaking in her hands had stopped. She said to Selim, "I do not remember yet." She said, "But I am going to." She said, "And when I do, the woman who burned my shawl will answer for more than my shawl." Selim bowed his head. The pale figures along the corridor outside the throne room turned, one by one, to face the door, as if a wind had passed through them. The dais beneath her warmed. The crown pulsed once, hard in agreement. They began with the dais. Selim pressed his palm flat against the stone, and the stone opened in a slow seam to reveal a shallow basin of dark water. He said, "This is the memory well. It will not give you everything at once. It will give you what you can carry tonight. Drink." She cupped the water in her hands. It tasted of iron and pine. She drank. The throne room folded inward, and she was elsewhere. She was standing in the snowfall. She was Saria. She wore a long gown the color of deep water, her feet bare on the snow, and she was walking because she had been told that if she walked into the snow and did not turn back, the war would not come. She had been lied to. She knew in the moment of walking that she had been lied to. She turned her head just once and saw the figure at the edge of the wood who had told her the lie. The figure was a woman with red hair, the color of an old burn. The woman was not Lady Ashford but had Lady Ashford's eyes, and Ilara understood with a slow, cold certainty that some bloodlines do not die, they only change their names. The memory released her. She was back at the well on her knees, the water dripping from her chin. Selim was watching her, very still. She said, "I know who lost me." Her voice was different. It was deeper. It was older. It was Saria's, layered under her own, and it was hers finally for the first time in her life. She said, "The Ashford line did not begin in the valley. The Ashford line began at the edge of the snow." Selim did not speak. He waited. She said, "Take me back to the manor before moonrise." She said, "I have a debt to collect." She said, "And then we will deal with Mordrev." The crown beat once, approving. They rose together from the well. The corridor was already filling with the pale figures, who were the old court of the Hollow, who had been waiting along the walls for 5 centuries to follow their queen out of the hill. They bowed as she passed. She did not bow back. The part of her that had been Mouse for 13 years was learning, very quickly, that the part of her that had been Saria for 1,000 was not gentle, not patient, and not in the habit of forgiving. They came up out of the hill at the old road behind the orchard. The moon was not yet at the second rise. The Ashford Manor stood at the end of the valley with its windows lit, the way a house lights itself when it is expecting guests it is afraid of. Lady Ashford was waiting on the front steps. She had taken off her black gloves. Her hands underneath were thin and white and very old, older than any face she had ever shown the staff. Alara understood Lady Ashford had been at the edge of the snow that night 500 years ago, and had not aged the way mortals age, because the pact she had honored for 9 generations had been honoring her back. Lady Ashford did not run. She said, "My queen," with a curl at the corner of her mouth, because she did not yet believe. Alara walked up the steps. The pale court did not follow her up. This was hers. She stopped one step below Lady Ashford and looked up into her face, the way she had looked up for 13 years from the floor of the long corridor. She said, "You took my comb." Lady Ashford blinked. She had been expecting a sentence about Sarah. She had not been expecting the comb. She said, "What?" Alara said, "On my first night you took the wooden comb my mother had pressed into my hand. You burned my shawl on the second night. On the third you taught me not to cry where you could hear me, because you were a collector of sounds. I am still a collector. I have collected every sound you ever made in my presence for 13 years, and tonight I am going to give them all back to you at once." Lady Ashford's thin white hands began to tremble. Alara lifted the crown from her own brow and held it between them. She said, "Kneel." Lady Ashford knelt. The knees gave first. That is the order in the hollow. The knees go before the face. Alara lowered the crown until the iron touched Lady Ashford's brow. The metal hummed very low, the way a knife hums against a whetstone. Lady Ashford screamed. It was the first true sound she had ever made in Alara's hearing, and Alara let it pass through her, because she had earned it. The crown drew the long years out of Lady Ashford the way a poultice draws out a fever. Her red hair turned white. Her thin face folded into the face she should have had centuries ago. When Alara lifted the crown away, Lady Ashford was a small old woman on the front step of her own manor, weeping in the only voice she had left. Alara set the crown back on her own brow. She said, "The pact is broken. The Ashford line ends tonight, not in blood but in years. Live the ones you stole." She walked back down the steps. The moon was almost at the second rise. Selim was waiting too, a little apart from his court, as if he were not sure he had the right to stand among them yet. She crossed to him. She did not speak. She lifted her hand and laid it flat against his chest, over the place where his heart had once been and where something quieter beat now. He closed his eyes. He covered her hand with his own. He said, "My queen." He said, "My wife." He said, "Welcome home." She said, "Not yet." She said, "Mordrev is still waiting." She said, "The Crimson Reach does not believe I have remembered." She said, "Let us not correct them too soon." Selim opened his eyes. He smiled for the first time in 500 years, and the smile was not a soft thing. It was the smile of a man who has been told he may put a great weight down and has decided instead to swing it. He said, "Then we ride." The pale court fell in behind them. The moon rose. They went into the wood. The Crimson Reach met them at the river. Mordrev sat on a black horse on the far bank with 12 riders behind him, all in red coats. He bowed to her across the water. He said, "Little queen, have you remembered?" She did not answer. She lifted one hand. The river answered for her. It rose very slowly between the two banks and kept rising, and the horses on the far side began to shy, and Mordrev's smile thinned. The water held there, a wall of dark river standing on its own end. She said across the wall, "You called me a door without a lock. I have a lock now. Leave the hollow before moonset, and I will let you keep your name." Mordrev did not leave. Mordrev had pride too. The pride is always the last thing. The river fell. It did not fall back into its bed. It fell forward, onto the far bank, in a single black weight, and took Mordrev and his 12 riders with it, and carried them down the valley toward a sea that no map in the hollow had ever named. The reach itself, deep in its keep beyond the wood, felt its lord go, and the keep folded inward as a thing folds when the spine is taken out of it. The valley released a breath it had been holding for 9 generations. They rode back to the hill. The pale court tended the corridor, set fires in the throne room, and laid a table on the dais for 2. Selim led her to the clean seat. He took the dusty one beside her and brushed 5 centuries of dust from the arms of it with the cuff of his sleeve. He said, "The war is over before it began. The pact is broken. The reach is gone. The hollow is yours. I am yours if you will still have me." She was looking at her own hands on the table. They were not the hands of a maid. They were not yet the hands of a queen. They were her hands, and that was new. She said, "I am going to keep the name Alara. Saria was the one who walked into the snow, and I am the one who walked out. But I will take the rest. The crown. The throne. You." Selim bowed his head over her hand. He kissed it once, slowly, the way men used to kiss the hands of women they had waited a very long time to see again. The wooden comb had been burned in the kitchen hearth by a girl 2 years older than Alara who had been told to do it, and had not known how to refuse. The girl was a housekeeper now, in the same manner that no longer had an Ashford in it. In the morning, Alara would send for her. She would not punish her. She would give her a position, and she would give her a comb. A queen who has been a maid knows the difference between justice and mercy in a way that a queen who has only ever been a queen does not. That was going to be the shape of her reign. The crown heard her think it and pulsed once, softly in agreement. Selim poured wine for her. It was dark and warm and tasted of iron and of pine, the same as the water from the memory well. She drank. He drank. They did not speak for a long time. He had waited 5 centuries to sit at this table with her, and she had waited 13 years to sit at any table at all, and the silence between them was full of every word that had not been said in the long hall with the black columns the night the snow began. They would say those words. They had time now. Outside the hill, the valley settled. The hounds at the manor stopped barking and lay down. The husband's empty chair at the Ashford table was quietly taken away by a maid who had finally been given permission. The hollow had a name again. The people in the valley, who had stopped saying the name aloud 2 centuries ago, began to remember it, the way you remember a song from childhood, 1 note at a time. By the next year, the valley would be on the maps again. By the next century, the Crimson Reach would be a story told to frighten other lords into behaving. In the throne room beneath the hill, the Queen of the Hollow set down her cup and took her husband's hand. The crown beat once, very slow, very content, and went still. She had returned. She had not, in the end, walked into the snow. She had walked out of it. The long story of the Hollow, which had been about something lost, became that night a story about something that had finally, after a very long winter, come home.